8 men paddled through black water, their arms burning, their lungs screaming, while behind them a Japanese locomotive thundered toward a bomb they had just buried with their bare hands. They had 90 seconds, maybe less. If the timing was wrong, if the current shifted, if a single Japanese soldier looked toward the water at the wrong moment, none of them would ever see home again. This was not a Marine landing, not an Army invasion, just 8 sailors from a submarine, armed with shovels made from scrap steel, and a plan born from a childhood memory about walnuts on a railroad track. What they were about to do had never been attempted in the history of naval warfare, and their commander, a man who already carried the Medal of Honor in his pocket, was betting all their lives on it. Somewhere north of them, a train was gaining speed. Somewhere behind them, a submarine sat helpless in water so shallow it could not dive. And somewhere in the darkness of the Sea of Okhotsk, on the coast of the Japanese home islands, 8 ordinary men were about to become the only American ground combatants to ever set foot on Japan itself and live to tell the story. At 0700 on July 19, 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey pressed his eye against the periscope of USS Barb and watched a Japanese supply train snake along the Karafuto coastline. The morning light was flat and gray, the kind of light that made the water and the sky nearly indistinguishable from one another. Smoke trailed from the locomotive's stack, thin and dark against the pale hills. Freight cars rattled behind it, carrying troops and ammunition that would kill American soldiers within weeks if an invasion of the Japanese home islands went forward. Inside the cramped control room, the air smelled of diesel oil and sweat, and the particular staleness that came from men who had been submerged too long. Fluckey did not blink. He had spent 3 years learning how to read a target, learning to see past the surface of a thing to the danger hidden inside it, and this one was still moving, still alive, still out of reach of every weapon his submarine carried. He was 31 years old, 5 war patrols as commander of Barb, 17 enemy ships sent to the bottom of the Pacific. The Japanese were running 6 trains a day along that coastal railroad, each one hauling 40 to 60 soldiers, along with ammunition and supplies bound for the garrison at Kashiho. Fluckey had been hunting these waters, the cold gray expanse of the Sea of Okhotsk, for 3 weeks straight. His eyes were tired, his mind was not. USS Barb was a Gato-class submarine, nearly 250 feet of riveted steel, displacing 2,400 tons submerged, crewed by 80 men who trusted their captain with a certainty that bordered on faith. Below decks, the men lived in bunks stacked between torpedoes and machinery, breathing recycled air, counting the hours until the next chance to surface and fill their lungs with something clean. They had learned to sleep through the groan of the pressure hull, the hum of the electric motors, the distant thud of depth charges that had, so far, always fallen somewhere else. She carried 4 Presidential Unit citations, 8 battle stars, a Navy unit commendation. She was one of the most decorated submarines in the entire Pacific Fleet, but her reputation did not come from the medals bolted to her conning tower. It came from the man who commanded her. 3 months earlier, Fluckey had received the Medal of Honor. The citation described what he had done in Namquan Harbor off the coast of China in January of 1945, and reading it felt like reading fiction. He had taken Barb into water so shallow that the submarine could not dive to escape. Minefields lined both sides of the approach. Japanese destroyers patrolled the harbor mouth. Inside, 30 merchant ships sat at anchor, protected by what Japanese naval planners believed was an impenetrable defensive position, a fortress of geography and firepower that no American submarine would dare challenge. Fluckey attacked anyway. 6 torpedoes tore into the convoy, then 4 more. Then Barb made a high-speed run across uncharted water on the surface, depth charges exploding around her hull close enough that men below decks braced themselves against bulkheads, waiting for the one that would find its mark. Japanese gunners fired blind into the darkness, tracer rounds arcing over black water, while Fluckey held his course through channels no American chart had ever recorded. When it was over, 8 enemy ships lay sunk or burning behind them. Not one American sailor was lost. Officers at Pearl Harbor called it the most audacious submarine attack of the entire war. Flucky read the praise, folded it away, and kept looking for the next target. By June of 1945, there was almost nothing left to sink. Japanese merchant shipping had nearly vanished from the Pacific, strangled by 3 years of relentless submarine warfare. American boats were coming home from patrol after patrol, with torpedoes still in their tubes, hunting an enemy fleet that no longer existed in any meaningful number. For most commanders, this would have meant a quiet final patrol, a chance to survive the war without further risk. Flucky wanted something else entirely. Before Barb's 12th and what would become her final war patrol, he walked into a meeting with the Navy's research and development staff and made an unusual request. He wanted rockets. The Mark 51 launcher held 12 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets, each one tipped with 10 pounds of high explosive and capable of striking a target 3 miles away. The Navy had built the system as a defense against kamikaze attacks on landing ships, never intended for a submarine, never tested on one. Flucky did not care. He argued, pushed, and eventually convinced the engineers to bolt one onto Barb's forward deck. When the welding was finished, Barb had become the only rocket-launching submarine in the entire United States Navy. She departed Midway on June 8, 1945, her hull loaded with 72 rockets and orders that amounted to a single sentence: raise hell along the Japanese coast. 2 weeks later, on June 20th, Barb reached the cold waters north of Hokkaido. 2 days after that, at 02:30 on June 22nd, Flucky surfaced 3 miles off the town of Shari. 20,000 people lived there, working in a factory district that fed supplies to the Japanese military machine. The submarine turned broadside to the shore. Flucky gave the order, and for the first time in the history of naval warfare, a submarine launched rockets against a target on land. 12 rockets fired in 5 seconds, screaming through the darkness and slamming into Shari's industrial waterfront. Fires bloomed across the shoreline. Before the Japanese could locate the source of the attack, Barb had already slipped beneath the waves and vanished. Over the following 3 weeks, Barb fired 60 more rockets at factory towns strung along the Hokkaido and Karafuto coastlines. Shikuka, Kashiho, Shiritori, Japan's largest paper mill, burned to the waterline. A leather tanning factory that produced pilot uniforms went up in flames. Small shipyards were reduced to twisted wreckage. Flucky also turned Barb's 4-inch deck gun against military installations along the shore, shelling targets that had never once considered themselves within range of an American weapon. The submarine operated with something close to impunity. By the middle of July, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were actively hunting for her, crisscrossing the coastal skies, searching for the vessel that kept appearing and disappearing like a ghost. Flucky kept moving. He kept striking. He kept the enemy off balance, never staying in one position long enough to be found. Then, on July 19th, while patrolling off the southern coast of Karafuto, he noticed something new through the periscope. A railroad ran within 400 yards of the coastline, close enough to watch from the water, close enough to study in detail. Trains moved along it constantly, day and night, locomotives hauling freight cars packed with troops and military cargo. This was not a single target. It was a supply artery, feeding Japanese forces who were digging in, preparing to resist the invasion that everyone on both sides of the Pacific knew was coming. Flucky watched the trains for 3 days. He counted their schedules, logged the intervals between them, noted which sections of track ran straight and which curved through the low hills. He studied the terrain along the track, the slope of the beach, the distance from the waterline to the rails, the places where a man on foot might move without being seen. Through the periscope, the coastline looked deceptively peaceful, green hills rolling down to a gray shoreline, small fishing villages tucked into the folds of the land, no hint of the war that had consumed the rest of the Pacific for 4 years. The beach looked accessible, the tracks looked vulnerable. And somewhere in the back of his mind, an idea began to take shape, one that no submarine commander in history had ever attempted to carry out. The obvious solution was also the weakest one. Barb could surface and shell the railroad with her deck gun, tearing up a section of track and forcing a temporary halt to traffic. But the Japanese would send repair crews within hours. The damage would be patched, the trains would run again by nightfall, and nothing of lasting value would have been achieved. Flucky did not want to damage a railroad. He wanted to destroy a moving train, loaded with soldiers, at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Maximum damage, maximum disruption, maximum psychological impact on an enemy who believed their home islands were still, at some fundamental level, safe from American boots on the ground. But a submarine was not built for this kind of war. Torpedoes were useless against a target on land. The rockets, powerful as they were against a stationary factory, lacked the precision needed to strike something moving at speed along a curving coastline. The deck gun could not track a locomotive weaving through hills and inlets. Every weapon aboard Barb had been designed for one kind of war, and this problem belonged to another kind entirely. Flucky stood in the control room that night, turning the problem over in his mind, the red battle lighting casting long shadows across the charts spread out before him. Somewhere out there in the darkness, 6 trains a day were carrying men and steel toward a fight that had not yet begun. Somewhere in his crew, 80 men were waiting for orders, trusting a captain who had never once asked them to do something ordinary, who had brought every one of them home alive through 5 war patrols when so many other boats had not returned at all. He needed a solution the Japanese would never see coming, something no submarine, in the long and violent history of undersea warfare, had ever tried. He was about to find one, and it would not come from a textbook, or from a weapons engineer, or from anyone above the rank of enlisted man. It would come from 2 sailors sitting in a cramped forward torpedo room, surrounded by the smell of grease and steel, turning over a memory from a childhood that neither of them could have imagined would one day matter to the outcome of a war. On the evening of July 22nd, Chief Gunner's Mate Paul Saunders and Electrician's Mate 3rd Class Billy Hatfield sat in Barb's cramped forward torpedo room with a problem that had no obvious solution. Flucky had given them a single instruction: find a way to destroy a moving train without leaving a man standing beside it when it exploded. The torpedo room smelled of oil and cold steel. The long brass shapes of the remaining torpedoes racked along both walls, and between the 2 sailors sat a 55-pound scuttling charge, the device Barb's crew would use to destroy their own submarine if she was ever in danger of falling into enemy hands. Hatfield stared at the charge for a long time without speaking. Then he told Saunders about something from his childhood in Kentucky, a trick every boy along the railroad tracks knew. You placed a walnut on the rail, hid in the brush, and waited for a freight train to come through. The weight of the locomotive would crack the shell wide open, clean as a hammer blow, without anyone needing to be anywhere near the tracks when it happened. Saunders sat with that idea for a moment before he understood what Hatfield was actually proposing. Not a walnut, a switch, something buried beneath the rail that would sit silent and harmless until the exact weight of a locomotive pressed down on it, and only then complete a circuit that no human hand needed to trigger. The train would destroy itself. Nobody would need to be standing anywhere near the tracks when it happened. They worked through the night. Hatfield, who had labored on the railroad before the war and understood the mechanics of rail beds and rolling stock better than any other man aboard Barb, found a micro-switch salvaged from submarine components and began adapting it for a purpose it was never built for. Saunders wired 3 dry cell batteries in series, testing each connection twice. When they finished, the entire assembly, batteries, switch, and detonator leads fit inside an empty pickle jar, sealed to keep seawater and morning dew from shorting the circuit before it ever reached the beach. Flucky examined the device the next morning, turning it over in his hands under the harsh light of the control room. A simple pressure switch, 3 batteries, a charge powerful enough to blow a 3-foot hole through a submarine's pressure hull, more than enough to turn a locomotive's boiler into shrapnel. When a train's weight depressed the rail even a quarter of an inch, the switch would close, and detonation would occur directly beneath the engine. Hatfield estimated the blast would destroy the first 3 cars outright and derail everything coupled behind them. The engineering was sound. It was elegant, even, in the way that only a soldier's improvisation can be elegant, born from spare parts and a memory of childhood mischief, rather than any manual or blueprint. The mission built around it was something else entirely. Barb would need to surface within 1,000 yards of the Japanese coastline, closer to shore than any American submarine had dared operate during the entire war. A shore party would paddle rubber rafts through the darkness, cross open beach and 400 yards of enemy-held ground, dig a hole beneath a live railroad, plant the explosive, and return before the sky began to lighten. If a Japanese patrol found them on the beach, there would be no rescue, no covering fire, no second chance. If the submarine herself was spotted while sitting exposed in shallow water, she would not have time to dive before shore batteries found her range. Flucky did the math in his head. 90 minutes. That was what he was willing to give them, from the moment the rafts touched water to the moment Barb had to be moving toward depth she could survive in. He called for volunteers, and every man aboard raised his hand. 80 sailors, none of them ordered, none of them required, stood ready to go ashore on enemy soil with shovels and a bomb built inside a pickle jar. Flucky had to choose only 8, and the criteria he set said as much about the man as any medal ever could. Unmarried men only. He would not create widows over this. Strong swimmers, in case the rafts capsized in the surf. Former Boy Scouts where possible, since Flucky had been a scout himself and trusted their instincts for navigation and quiet movement in unfamiliar terrain. And a mix of skills, an electrician to manage the device, strong backs to dig, steady hands who could handle a raft in total darkness without a word spoken between them. 8 names came off that list. Chief Gunner's Mate Paul Saunders would lead the party, 26 years old, aboard Barb since her commissioning in 1942, a veteran of every patrol she had ever run in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. Billy Hatfield would carry the device itself, the only man aboard who understood both the wiring and the mechanics of the rails it would sit beneath. Signalman Second Class Francis Sever, Ship's Cook First Class Lawrence Newland, Torpedoman's Mate Third Class Edward Klinglesmith, Motor Machinist's Mate Second Class James Richard, Motor Machinist's Mate First Class John Markison, and Lieutenant William Walker, the officer who would carry ultimate responsibility for every man on that beach. None of them were career adventurers. They were farm boys and factory hands and small-town sons who had enlisted because the country asked them to, and now they found themselves preparing to walk onto the coast of the enemy's home islands, carrying homemade tools and a bomb hidden inside a pickle jar. When the list was read aloud, nobody complained about being chosen. Nobody asked to be left off it either. Preparation consumed the days that followed. Barb's engineers cut steel plates from the lower flats of the engine room and hammered them into crude picks and shovels, tools that had never existed until a submarine crew needed to dig a hole on enemy soil. The shore party packed emergency supplies in case they were ever cut off from the beach and forced to flee overland toward Soviet-controlled territory on the northern half of Sakhalin, 130 miles through mountains that offered no roads and no mercy. They packed sharpened stakes as well, a crude defense against the guard dogs' intelligence report said patrolled sections of the coastal railroad. Nobody aboard Barb pretended those stakes would do much good against a trained animal in the dark. They packed them anyway, because doing something felt better than doing nothing. Weather became the deciding factor neither Flucky nor his crew could control. He needed heavy cloud cover to blot out the 3/4 moon hanging over the coast. A clear sky would light up the rafts and the submarine-like targets on a firing range for any Japanese sentry looking out to sea. For 4 straight days, Barb patrolled off Karafuto while the men watched the horizon clear, cloud, and clear again, each cycle tightening the knot in Flucky's stomach. Only 5 days remained before Barb's patrol schedule required her to turn east for Midway. The window was closing, and there would be no second attempt. On the afternoon of July 22nd, thin cirrus clouds began gathering on the horizon. By evening, thick white stratus clouds had built up over the mountain peaks along the Karafuto shoreline, rolling in from the west with the promise of real cover. Flucky watched the sky for an hour before he made his decision. Tonight. There would not be a better night, and there might not be another night at all. The final hours moved fast. The shore party checked their gear one final time. Waterproof flashlights, pistols, carried more for the confidence of having them than any real hope they would be used. The pickle jar, wrapped and secured. Digging tools lashed to packs. Mae West life vests in case the surf turned rough on the return. 2 rubber rafts were readied on Barb's narrow deck, and at 2300 hours, the submarine began her final approach toward the coastline, running slow and quiet on her electric motors to keep the noise of her passage below anything a listening post on shore might catch. The sky held. Cloud cover smothered the moon completely, and the water turned the color of wet slate, black on black, the kind of darkness that swallowed even the outline of a man standing 3 feet away. Through the periscope, Flucky watched the railroad running parallel to the beach. No lights visible anywhere along its length, no sign of patrol activity. Conditions were as good as they were ever going to get. Barb crept to within 950 yards of shore. The depth gauge read only 36 feet of water beneath her keel. If a Japanese patrol boat appeared now, the submarine would have perhaps 90 seconds to crash dive, and there was a real chance she would strike bottom before she was fully submerged. Flucky was betting the entire boat, and every man aboard her, on darkness and silence holding just a few hours longer. The 8 men gathered on deck in dark clothing, faces smudged with grease to kill any shine, voices reduced to whispers that barely carried past the next man's shoulder. Some checked their gear for the 3rd or 4th time, fingers running over straps and buckles that had already been checked. Nobody spoke about what waited on the beach. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in planning, and saying it again now would only give the fear more room to grow. Saunders checked his watch. Midnight was close. Flucky gave the order, and the rafts went over the side. They hit the water at 0005 on July 23rd. Saunders and Walker took the lead raft with Hatfield and Sever beside them. The second raft carried Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, and Markison. Paddles dipped into the black water without a splash, the men working in a rhythm they had practiced and rehearsed until it required no thought at all. Behind them, Barb sat low and dark against the ocean, barely distinguishable from the water itself. 25 minutes of steady paddling brought the rafts to the beach. They grounded on sand at 0030, and all 8 men hauled the boats above the high tide line, hiding them behind rocks and driftwood that had washed up along the shore. Newland and Richard stayed behind to guard the rafts and keep the escape route open, ready to signal the others if a patrol appeared. The remaining 6 men moved inland, and in that moment they became the first American combat troops in the history of the war to set foot on one of Japan's home islands. Karafuto was Japanese sovereign territory, administered from Tokyo, populated by Japanese civilians, and defended by Japanese soldiers. Every step forward was a step across a line no American had crossed before. If they were caught, the protections of the Geneva Convention would mean nothing. Saboteurs found in civilian darkness behind enemy lines could expect no trial worth the name. The terrain fought them from the first stride. The air smelled of salt and wet grass and something faintly like wood smoke drifting from a village they could not see. Tall grass hid uneven ground, and Sever nearly went down hard when his boot dropped into a hidden depression. They slowed their pace, testing each step before trusting their weight to it. 50 yards inland, a drainage ditch cut across their path, 3 feet deep with standing water at the bottom. They lowered themselves in one at a time, crossed the mud, and climbed the far bank soaked to the waist, their clothing heavier now, clinging to their skin. 100 yards from the beach, they crossed a packed earth road, tire tracks visible even in the darkness. Saunders held up a fist. The men crouched in the grass and listened. No engines, no voices, nothing moving. They crossed the road one at a time and pushed on toward the railroad embankment, a dark ridge rising against a sky only slightly less black than the ground. They reached the base of the embankment at 0050, chests heaving from the effort of moving fast while staying silent, a contradiction that left every muscle burning. Walker and Saunders climbed to the rails and studied the layout. The track ran north and south along a raised bed of gravel and crushed stone, wooden ties spaced evenly beneath steel rails polished smooth by years of traffic. The position offered clear sight lines in both directions, which was exactly the problem. Anyone approaching along the tracks would see them just as easily as they would see a train. There was no time to find a better spot. They had to work fast, and they had to work now. Before a single shovel touched the ground, Sever seized Saunders by the arm and pointed north. A tremor ran through the rails beneath their boots, then a sound, faint at first, growing into the unmistakable rhythm of a locomotive. A train was coming. The men dropped flat into the grass beside the embankment. Hatfield pulled the pickle jar tight against his chest, cradling it like something alive. The vibration built steadily until it became a full chugging roar, and at 0055, the locomotive burst into view from the north, running with every light extinguished under strict blackout discipline. It passed within 15 feet of where the Americans lay pressed into the dirt, steam hissing from its couplings, iron wheels clacking over every rail joint, the ground shuddering under 6 men who did not dare breathe too loudly. They counted the cars in silence as they passed. 1, 2, 5, 10, 15 in total, and then the sound faded south toward Kashiho, leaving only ringing silence behind it. Saunders made them wait 2 full minutes after the last car vanished before he gave the signal to move again. The men climbed the embankment and took their positions. Klingelsmith moved 50 yards north along the tracks to stand watch. Sever went the same distance south. Walker stayed central, positioned to see both directions at once and keep an eye on the road they had crossed. That left Saunders, Hatfield, and Markison to do the digging. Hatfield chose the spot with care, a straight stretch of track where an approaching train would be running at full speed, no curve to slow it, no grade to rob it of momentum. The rails here ran level across open ground for at least half a mile in either direction. He knelt between the rails and began marking where the charge needed to sit, directly beneath the western rail, where a locomotive's weight would press down hardest. Saunders and Markison began digging with their improvised tools. The first few inches of gravel came away easily. Then, 6 inches down, the shovels struck compacted earth laced with buried stone, and the work slowed to something exhausting and loud, steel scraping against rock in the stillness of a sleeping coastline, every sound seeming to carry for miles in the dark. Hatfield checked his watch again and again. They had already been ashore for 30 minutes. Flucky would not wait past 90. At 01:15, Sever gave a soft, low whistle from his position to the south. Another train, this one moving north, the opposite direction from the first. The men dropped flat again, instantly and without a word. Hatfield lay beside the half-dug hole, the pickle jar still pressed against him, the shovels and picks scattered across the gravel in plain view of anyone who happened to look down at the tracks with a light. If this locomotive's headlight was burning, the mission would end here, in the dark, on a stretch of foreign railroad 400 yards from the sea. It came through blacked out, just like the first. 14 cars this time, Hatfield counting silently as they clattered past overhead, the war continuing to protect the very men trying to end it a little sooner. When the sound finally died away to the north, Saunders got the party moving again, though his hands, when he reached again for the shovel, were not quite as steady as they had been an hour earlier. 2 trains in 22 minutes. The railroad was busier at night than anyone aboard Barb had guessed from the periscope, and every man on that embankment now understood that a third train or a foot patrol walking the line could appear at any moment without warning. They dug with everything they had left. Markison drove the shovel into the loosened earth again and again, while Saunders worked the pick against the stubborn rock beneath. Within 15 minutes they had opened a space roughly a foot square and 8 inches deep beneath the rail. Enough room for the charge, the batteries, and the switch. Hatfield lifted the components out of the pickle jar one by one. The scuttling charge went in first, packed firm with earth to hold it steady. The 3 batteries followed, nestled beside it. Then came the wiring, done mostly by feel, his flashlight angled down into the hole so its glow could not be seen from a distance. The micro switch was the piece that mattered most. Japanese locomotives typically weighed between 60 and 80 tons, weight that would press the rail down somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch when it rolled across this exact spot. Too shallow, and ordinary vibration from the rail expanding in the heat of the day might trigger it early. Too deep, and the switch might never close at all. Hatfield set it by touch, adjusting it twice before he was satisfied, then ran the final lead from the detonator back toward the switch and stopped, leaving that last connection open. The device would stay safe, inert, harmless, until the moment they were ready to leave it behind for good. By 01:35, the wiring was finished except for that single connection. Hatfield looked up at Saunders and nodded once. Saunders signaled Walker, and the 2 men standing watch began falling back toward the work site, Klingelsmith from the north, Sever from the south, boots moving carefully over gravel that could betray them with a single loose stone. All 6 men gathered at the hole. Hatfield made the last connection with steady hands. The circuit was live now. Any real weight pressing down on that rail would complete it. He covered the device with the same dirt and gravel they had dug out, smoothing the surface until it matched the undisturbed ballast on either side. In daylight, a careful inspector walking the line might notice the faint disturbance. In darkness, at speed, an engineer would see nothing at all. The shore party moved off the embankment and started back the way they had come, across the road, through the drainage ditch, through the tall grass that had nearly tripped them on the way in. They moved faster now, the weight of the finished mission pressing them forward. Every extra minute on Japanese soil was a minute closer to disaster. At 01:45 they reached the beach, where Newland and Richard were waiting beside the hidden rafts, already scanning the tree line for any sign of trouble. All 8 men dragged the rafts down to the waterline and climbed aboard, arms and legs coated in mud, chests still tight with the effort of the crossing. Saunders glanced at the luminous dial of his watch. 1 hour and 40 minutes ashore, almost to the minute of what Flucky had allowed them. Out past the surf line, Barb was already preparing to move. The rafts pushed off from the sand, and the men bent into their paddles, driving toward the black shape of the submarine, waiting for them in water no vessel her size should have dared to sit in for this long. They were halfway back when the night went from tense to something closer to terror. Somewhere behind them, along the tracks they had just walked away from, the ground had begun to hum again. Every man in both rafts felt it more than heard it. A vibration carried across the water from a source none of them could yet see, and every man understood exactly what it meant without a single word passing between them. Flucky's voice cut through the darkness from Barb's conning tower, carried by a megaphone he had never expected to need this close to shore. Paddle faster. He had spotted the train through the periscope while tracking his men's progress back across the water, a locomotive running north with its headlight dark, heading directly for the stretch of track where Hatfield had buried the charge minutes earlier. The timing was going to be close enough to break a man's nerve. Saunders and the others drove their paddles into the water with everything they had left, arms burning, lungs raw, the raft still 400 yards from the submarine that was their only way home. Barb sat low in the water, her hull barely visible, Flucky having brought her within 600 yards of the beach to cut the distance his men had to cover, a decision that put 36 feet of water beneath a keel that needed far more room than that to dive safely. Every man aboard who wasn't required elsewhere stood on deck, watching the rafts close the gap one desperate stroke at a time. 300 yards, 200. The locomotive's silhouette grew sharper against the sky, moving fast, perhaps 40 miles an hour, the engineer pushing hard through a straight, level section of coastal track that offered nothing to slow him down, a mile north of the buried charge. Then less, 90 seconds maybe, before 8 tons of steel and steam would roll directly over Hatfield's hidden switch. Flucky faced a decision no manual could have prepared him for. Wait for the rafts, and risk being caught on the surface when Japanese forces converged on the explosion. Dive now, and strand 8 men in open water with no submarine left to reach. He chose to wait, ordering Barb to begin turning toward deeper water while holding position just long enough, betting the boat on 8 men who had earned every second of that risk. The rafts reached Barb's hull at 01:46. The men scrambled up through the deck hatches, hands reaching down to haul the last man aboard. Saunders came up out of the water last, and the rubber rafts were cut loose and abandoned. No time to recover them. The hatches sealed. Barb's diesels roared to life, and the submarine began pulling away from the coast, accelerating toward water deep enough to save her. At 0:47, the northbound train reached the buried device. 68 tons of locomotive pressed down on the western rail, the micro-switch closed, and 55 pounds of high explosive detonated directly beneath the boiler. Even from 700 yards offshore, already moving, the crew of Barb saw the fireball rise along the embankment like something tearing open the night itself. The boiler ruptured on impact, adding a scream of superheated steam to the blast. Metal fragments arced 200 feet into the air and came down burning. The locomotive came apart in pieces, its boiler splitting into 3 sections, drive wheels torn free of the frame. The cab and smokestack hurled forward and tumbling end over end down the slope toward the beach. The freight cars behind it had no chance to brake. The first car slammed into the wreckage and folded like paper. The second climbed over the first and splintered. Cars kept piling in behind, one after another, until the whole train lay twisted across the embankment, fires spreading through broken wood and spilled cargo, ammunition somewhere in the wreckage beginning to cook off in secondary explosions that rolled like thunder across the water. Flucky called every man who could be spared up onto the deck to see it. Dozens of submariners crowded the hull and conning tower, watching fire climb the dark hillside of a country most of them had only ever seen through a periscope. Whatever that train had carried, and every indication pointed to soldiers and supplies bound for the defense of the home islands, it would never reach its destination. Barb kept running, engines at full power, putting distance between herself and a coastline that was about to come violently awake. The Japanese response arrived within minutes. Searchlights swept out from at least 3 positions along the shore, hunting for the vessel responsible. Barb was still on the surface, still too close to safety. Flucky ordered a hard turn northeast, away from the search pattern, diesels running at 150% overload, the same emergency setting that had carried them out of Namquan Harbor 6 months earlier. The submarine cut through the water at 23 knots, leaving a wake that glowed faintly with phosphorescence. The depth gauge crept upward, 48 feet, still too shallow. At 0200, Barb crossed into 60 feet of water, and Flucky gave the order to dive. Within 90 seconds, she slipped beneath the surface, invisible now to every searchlight still sweeping empty water above her. She stayed under for 6 hours, creeping away from Karafuto at a crawl to keep her engine noise below anything Japanese listening equipment might catch. At 0800, Flucky risked raising the periscope. No patrol boats in sight. The searchlights had gone dark with the dawn. Far off, a thin column of smoke still rose from the wreckage on the embankment, the only visible trace of what 8 men and 1 pickle jar had accomplished in the dark. Barb surfaced in deeper water and resumed her patrol, and Flucky, with 4 days remaining before he had to turn for Midway, was not finished yet. Over the following 3 days, Barb kept striking. On July 24th, she shelled a military radio station off Shari, collapsing the antenna array and setting the building ablaze. On July 25th, she hit a shipyard at Shiraoi, destroying 2 coastal freighters still under construction. On July 26th, she fired her final 12 rockets at a garrison on Kaihio Island, before turning for open water. Japanese aircraft crisscrossed the Sea of Okhotsk, hunting for the submarine that had spent a month tearing at their coastline, and Flucky evaded every one of them through constant movement and the discipline to dive the instant a plane appeared. On July 27th, Barb set course for Midway. Her 12th war patrol, and her last, was complete. She reached Midway on August 2, 1945. The crew assembled on deck in dress uniforms holding a battle flag unlike any other in the Navy, crowded with 17 patches for ships sunk, symbols for a presidential unit citation and a Navy unit commendation, rocket and gun emblems for the shore bombardments, ribbons for 6 Navy crosses and dozens of silver and bronze stars, and at the top, a Medal of Honor ribbon for her captain. At the bottom center, stitched in new thread, sat a small locomotive. No other submarine in naval history carried that symbol, because no other submarine had ever earned it. Admiral Chester Nimitz came to Midway himself to greet them. The 8 men who had gone ashore on Carafuto, Saunders, Hatfield, Sever, Newland, Klingelsmith, Richard, Markison, and Walker stood together for a photograph that would end up in the naval archives. Young men who looked like they belonged on a farm or in a factory, rather than in the pages of naval history. Flucky received his 4th Navy Cross for that final patrol, a citation naming both the rocket bombardments and the train explosion. Combined with his Medal of Honor and 3 earlier Navy Crosses, he became one of the most decorated submarine commanders the country ever produced, and when reporters asked him about it, he turned the credit back toward his crew every time. 6 days after Barb reached Midway, an atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. 9 days later, Japan surrendered. The war ended before Barb could sail again, closing the book on 12 war patrols, 5 in the Atlantic and 7 in the brutal Pacific campaign, a record that included 17 confirmed enemy vessels sunk and nearly 100,000 tons of shipping destroyed, along with the carrier Unyo, sent to the bottom of the South China Sea the previous September, with most of her crew still aboard. But it was the train that historians kept returning to, decade after decade. Not because it was Barb's most destructive strike, but because it proved something no naval planner had fully understood before that July night. A submarine could do more than sink ships. It could launch rockets, shell a coastline, put men ashore, let them strike a target with their own hands, and bring every one of them home again. The rocket launcher Flucky had insisted on bolting to Barb's deck, dismissed by some as a desperate improvisation, would echo forward through decades of naval design, a rough ancestor to the missile submarines that came to define undersea warfare. Barb herself did not get the ending her crew might have wished for her. Decommissioned in 1947, briefly recommissioned for training in 1951, decommissioned again in 1954, she was loaned that same year to the Italian Navy and renamed Enrico Tazzoli. She served under an Italian flag for 18 years before age caught up with her, and in 1972 she was sold for scrap for roughly $100,000, about the price of a modest house. When Flucky learned what had happened, he said that if the crew had known in time, they would have pooled their own money to buy her back as a museum ship. Nobody knew in time. Only her battle flag survived, hanging today behind glass at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, the small locomotive still stitched at the bottom. Eugene Flucky stayed in the Navy another 27 years, rising to Rear Admiral, commanding the entire Pacific Submarine Force, finishing his career as Director of Naval Intelligence, before retiring in 1972. He did not retire into comfort. He and his wife moved to Portugal and spent 8 years running an orphanage, work he continued until it closed in 1982. He published his memoir, Thunder Below, in 1992, and it became required reading at the Naval Academy he had once graduated from. He died in 2007 at the age of 93 and was buried at the Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis. Of every number attached to his career, tonnage sunk, medals earned, rockets fired, the one Flucky valued most was 0. 0 Purple Hearts among the men who served under him across 5 war patrols. 0 men lost. He pushed his crew to the outer edge of what a submarine and her sailors could survive, again and again, and every time he brought them home. History still debates the precise wording of what happened that July night on the Karafuto coast, whether it stands as the only American ground action on Japanese soil or simply one of the rarest, since other islands under Japanese administration saw American troops before the war's end. What no one debates is what 8 submariners did with shovels, batteries, and a pickle jar on a beach 950 yards from a submarine that had no business surfacing there at all. They walked onto enemy ground in darkness, buried a bomb beneath a nation's war machine, and paddled home just fast enough to watch it work.